How's it going, guys? It's Cole from See-Through Panel, showing off Gideon Falls, Book 1, The Legend of the Black Barn, written by Jeff Lemire, art by Andrea Sorrentino, colored by Dave Stewart, published by Image Comics in this nice deluxe edition, retailing for $50 US, containing 16 issues of a 27-issue story. So a little bit more than half, a nice big hardcover. I do have problems with it being called a deluxe hardcover, but we'll get into that in a moment. First, though, I will not be spoiling anything about the story with my words. I'm going to go loosely over the plot and the art, but I may be flipping through some panels and pages that you would be spoiled by, so if you're worried about getting spoiled for this story, which it is a wonderful story, just come back after you've read it. We could talk about it then. So, I finished this book 1. I've yet to read book 2, and I wanted to do a review of the series roughly halfway, thematically halfway, because it's a pretty complex story and has a lot of twists and turns, and I want to keep everything straight and give a fair review of the two halves of the story, as much as they are two halves of a larger story. And they're big enough books that I thought it'd be fair to review it just one at a time. I'll show off both books here in terms of thickness. So this is book 2 here, a little bit smaller, only about 10 issues. This one's 16. Same kind of treatment with the spot varnish. I've yet to read this, so I'm not going to open it up or anything like that. My issue with both of them is that for a deluxe hardcover, you would imagine a sewn binding. This is a glued binding, much cheaper and less durable, and it doesn't give an eye when you open it, which is the kind of raised binding. You can see it's not raised at all there, and it means you're going to have a lot more gutter loss on double page spreads. So I'll show off what I mean by that. Other than that, the book is awesome. I think the production's really nice, and I like the color scheme. They went for the black end papers and the red varnish and everything. Very fitting for the story, but just sometimes rough with that, with those double page spreads. So this first half is called The Legend of the Black Barn. That is because one of our two main characters here, Norton, always wearing the mask, mostly always, is finding pieces of something in the trash. He's obsessing over taking these things out of the trash, and he thinks he's finding pieces of a greater whole. He doesn't know what that hole is, but he's finding pieces of it, and he wants to eventually try and rebuild it or figure out what it is, why it's meaningful to him, because he's got gaps in his memory, and this is kind of something he's latched onto to make him at least keep moving forward. And before I continue, this is one example of gutter loss. From here, it doesn't look that bad until you realize he's actually going into a doorway here. Norton is on the page, and there's a doorway we basically can't see. You kind of like spread it out and look at it from an angle maybe, but from right here, pretty much impossible to tell what's going on. And that's not super important for the story, this spread specifically, but it gets pretty weird. Luckily, there's never usually, in most comics, there's not often word balloons directly in the middle of the page, so we don't miss a lot of dialogue, but a lot of important details, I think, are going to be missed throughout the entirety of the story, just because the glued binding doesn't open up as well as a sewn binding would, and you'd be able to see all of those details in the middle. Skipping forward to show some of those details. Those details in the middle would be, you know, a lot easier to see with the sewn binding like that, so I won't be able to find one, of course, as I'm talking about it, but we'll get there eventually. In terms of art style, Andrea Sorrentino sometimes is a bit photoshoppy for me, but I think in this book he does a fantastic job of going for intense realism and just a really psychological horror kind of grittiness with the way he's rendering everything with these lines going through them. Very rough looking. I really enjoy how he's making this story look. I had some issues in a couple other things like Green Arrow. On some panels it just looks a bit too much like Photoshop. There's a nice horror panel for you. But in this series, I think he's really come into his own and looks very much wholly original, even though I'm sure, like most artists, he's using reference, which is totally fine to use reference. It's just sometimes it's a little easier to tell the reference. And there's another spread that, when you kind of space it out, not a lot of loss, just like a little bit there. But in general, just it kind of sucks sometimes to not be getting all those details for it's a $50 hardcover, so I think it should probably have a sewn binding for that cost. It's just, you know, you pay a little more for Image, DC, and Marvel. Usually the indie guys have pretty well-made books for a decent price, but anyway, the story begins as a kind of horror thriller. Not entirely horrific, not a lot of body horror or anything like that, but very eerie, atmospheric, conspiratorial. As we progress, it kind of gets away from that and becomes more higher fantasy. I wouldn't say high fantasy, but definitely a fantasy element and kind of almost sci-fi as well. I think it loses a bit of that horror edge to it, but I'm totally fine with that. I think it felt like a natural progression for the story to go that way, and it kind of in the beginning we're under a microscope and things are horrifying, but as we expand outward and zoom out and see the whole landscape of this story, it really becomes very open and much more, how should I say, the themes presented in the beginning issues are reinforced later in the story, but with completely different methods of storytelling. Not the horror, not the you know, like this spooky priest guy jumping out at you like that. It's more of a dreadful thing that comes out of the narrative and the kind of, I can't get too deep into it without spoiling anything, but it does stay, you know, in that wheelhouse, but just kind of comes at it from a different angle later in the story. And I just want to show this off because I think Dave Stewart's use of red in this is consistently awesome, and I think it makes a lot of sense for Sorrentino to do these kind of inset panels that he does, and Dave Stewart coloring those red really sets it apart. And when he does use it for other panels too, it just really kicks it into high gear how otherworldly and ethereal and not of this world. I suppose I already said that, but everything is that happens. But I'm going to keep this video fairly short because I've only read half the series, obviously, but what I wanted to get across mainly was my dismay at the production value of this book with a $50 price tag, but also I'm really excited to finish this story because I think it keeps evolving and changing and is kind of genre-defying in the way that it's technically a horror thriller book, but it's really like getting to that fantasy sci-fi realm. The cast is growing, but I think we're about to be at critical mass for the size of the cast here. And I'm excited to finally dig deeper into all these characters rather than continue to add characters to the story. I really enjoyed it. I give ratings. I don't give ratings on the channel, but I give ratings to all my books that I read myself out of 10. It's kind of arbitrary and just is what I'm feeling in the moment, but for this I gave the story like a 9. It's a wonderful story. The art is definitely subject to your taste. It's very realistic, but also very atmospheric, and the way he uses these sketchy backgrounds looks hand-drawn with a colored pencil or a crayon. Uses that multiple times, like right there in the background. I think it works 100% for a story like this. I think it wouldn't make a lot of sense on a superhero book, but in this more grounded as a, I can't even say that, as grounded as this book is, which it's not 100%, it does feel much more grounded because of the realism presented by the art. And I think it's kind of just a wonderful pairing. Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino, they did Green Arrow together, they've done this together. I'm missing one big thing they also did together, but I can't recall. Here's his second style, by the way. A bit looser. It looks less referencey to me. I'm not sure if that's what it is. It just looks a bit more... it leans a bit more Euro, like Mobius style, with the way he doesn't use any ink. Just a lot of lines to shade and show texture and things like that. So I've loved to see this secondary style. And Dave Stewart's use of gradient here coming down is really cool. Yeah, this won't be a full review of the series. I definitely will make a video about the second hardcover, The Eater of All Things. But for now, halfway through the story, I am really enjoying this book. My main takeaway would be Image Comics, just shill out a little bit more of that money and just get the sewn binding. It'll make the book last a lot longer. This might not even last through a reread, like a second reading. So But I would recommend the book, the story itself entirely. Maybe not the hardcover, but the story, the actual comics, fantastic. So I'll come back with a review on book 2 as soon as I'm done with it. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.